The unthinkable attack. The hope of humanity was more than just a ship. It was a symbol of peace, a massive hospital vessel, painted white with a red cross. It carried doctors, nurses, and wounded soldiers. It floated in the vast darkness of space, moving toward the neutral zone, where it would deliver medical aid to refugees. On the bridge, Captain Elias Carter stood with his hands behind his back, watching the glowing screens. The crew worked calmly around him. Everything was routine. "This is our last stop before heading home," said Lieutenant Meyer, his second in command. "After this, we get some well-earned rest." Carter smiled. "We save lives, Lieutenant. That's all the rest I need." The crew chuckled. It was a good day. But good days don't last long in the cold emptiness of space. A sudden alarm blared through the ship. The bridge crew snapped to attention. Carter turned toward the main screen. "Unidentified ships detected," one of the officers shouted. "How many?" Carter asked, his voice calm but firm. "At least 6. No, 10. They're approaching fast." Carter frowned. This was neutral space. No one was supposed to carry weapons here, let alone attack a hospital ship. "Send out a distress signal," he ordered, "and open a comm channel. Maybe this is a misunderstanding." A few seconds later, the comm officer shook his head. "No response, sir." They're charging weapons." Carter's stomach turned cold. "Shields up," he barked. But it was too late. A brilliant blast of energy struck the side of the hope of humanity, sending a shockwave through the entire ship. People were thrown from their seats, alarms screamed, and the lights flickered. "We're hit," Meyer shouted, gripping the railing to keep himself steady. "Medical bay reporting casualties." Another officer called out. "Who are they?" Carter demanded. The enemy ships came into view, sleek, black warships, their hulls covered in glowing alien symbols. The Zarkali Empire. Carter's eyes narrowed. "We need to tell them who we are. They have to stop." The comm officer tried again. "This is the hope of humanity, a medical vessel under neutral protection. We are unarmed. We have civilians and wounded aboard. Repeat, we are a hospital ship." The Zarkali response came in a single cold transmission. "No witnesses." Carter felt ice creep into his veins. They weren't here by accident. This was an execution. Another blast struck the hull, followed by a second, then a third. Fire erupted in the corridors. The screams of injured crew filled the ship's comms. "Main power failing. Hull breach on Deck 3. We're losing people." Carter gritted his teeth. His ship was burning, but he wouldn't let them die for nothing. "Activate emergency escape pods," he commanded. "Get as many out as you can." The hope of humanity trembled as another explosion ripped through the engines. The power flickered again. The ship was dying. Down in the medical bay, Dr. Sarah Whitmore struggled to help the wounded. The ship shook violently, sending medical equipment crashing to the floor. A young nurse grabbed her arm, eyes wide with fear. "Doctor, what do we do?" Sarah looked around at the injured, some too weak to move, others staring in horror as the walls cracked. She clenched her jaw. "We hold on. We do what we can." But deep down, she knew the truth. They weren't going to make it. Back on the bridge, Carter looked at the dying screens. He tapped into the ship's final transmission system. If nothing else, the galaxy needed to know what happened here. "This is Captain Elias Carter of the Hope of Humanity," he said, voice steady despite the chaos around him. "We are under attack by the Zarkali Empire. They do not care for peace. They do not spare the innocent. We are a hospital ship, and they are slaughtering us." Another explosion rocked the ship. Smoke filled the air. "If anyone receives this message," Carter continued, "tell Earth. Tell them what happened here." The final explosion came without warning. The hope of humanity was no more. Only silence remained. But far away, deep in space, Earth received the distress signal. And Earth did not forget. Earth's reaction. War it is. The United Terran Command, UTC headquarters stood as a fortress in Earth's orbit, a massive space station watching over the planet like a silent guardian. Inside, the war room was filled with the hum of holographic displays, tactical officers, and high-ranking officials. The usual atmosphere of calculated calm was shattered when the distress signal from the Hope of Humanity came through. Silence gripped the room as the grainy transmission played. "This is Captain Ilias Carter of the Hope of Humanity. We are under attack by the Zarkali Empire. They do not care for peace. They do not spare the innocent. We are a hospital ship, and they are slaughtering us. Tell Earth. Tell them what happened here." Then, only static. The recording ended, but no one spoke. It felt as if the very air had frozen solid. A young officer's voice finally broke the silence. "Sir, final confirmation just came in. The Hope of Humanity is gone. No survivors." For a long moment, Admiral William Graves said nothing. He simply stared at the holographic display, showing the coordinates of the attack, his expression unreadable. The other officers watched him carefully. They knew what this meant, what it had to mean. Finally, Graves inhaled deeply, his steel-gray eyes burning with controlled fury. "They didn't just attack a ship," he said, his voice even but cold. "They declared war on Earth." The room tensed. Some of the younger officers looked at one another, uncertain. Others, the veterans, nodded grimly. They had seen this before. They knew what came next. One of the diplomats hesitated. "Sir, the Zarkali Empire is powerful." Engaging them cooled. Graves turned toward him, his gaze sharp as a blade. "They slaughtered doctors, children, the wounded. No warnings, no mercy. And you want to talk about diplomacy?" His voice hardened. "Let me make one thing very clear. Earth does not negotiate with butchers." The war room erupted into action. Orders were sent across the system. Terran warships, once resting in their docks, were suddenly preparing for war. Soldiers were recalled from leave. Battleships, dreadnoughts, and carriers came online, their engines roaring to life. A massive display flickered in the center of the room, showing the Terran Fleet Status Report. Supercarrier Retribution, ready for deployment. Dreadnought Titan's Wrath, standing by Battleship Warborn, awaiting orders. Carrier Class Inferno, fighters armed and fueled. Destroyer squadrons, preparing for assault maneuvers. One by one, the lights blinked green. The full might of Earth's military was preparing for vengeance. The Terran fleet awakens. Across the lunar shipyards, Earth's most advanced warships began to rise from their docks, their sleek hulls shining under the glow of distant stars. The sheer size and power of the fleet was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Thousands of pilots and crew members boarded their stations, strapping into fighter jets, bombers, and battleships. Engineers rushed through metal corridors, running last-minute system checks. Weapons officers loaded railguns, missile bays, and plasma cannons. The entire solar system watched as Earth's response unfolded. In a massive control room on the Retribution, Admiral Graves stood before a team of high-ranking officers, his face hard as stone. "We're not here to conquer," he said. "We're not here to play politics. We're here for justice." He turned toward the holographic star map, where a glowing red marker indicated the Zarkali Empire's borders. "They thought we'd stay silent, that we'd cower." His fists clenched behind his back. "They are about to learn what happens when you make an enemy of Earth." A heavy silence followed. Then a voice echoed through the bridge. "Fleet status. Green. All ships ready for war." Graves gave a single nod. "Then let's remind the galaxy why you don't attack humanity." Message to the galaxy, Earth's warning. Before the fleet launched, Earth's final warning was broadcast across the known galaxy. A simple transmission, but one that would be remembered forever. A holographic image of Admiral Graves appeared, his gaze sharp as a dagger. "To the rulers of the Zarkali Empire, your crime has been witnessed. You have one chance. Surrender the ones responsible, or face the full wrath of Earth. A pause. His next words were spoken without emotion. You have 24 hours. The transmission ended. The galaxy held its breath. Would the Zarkali surrender? Would they beg for mercy? Or would they seal their fate? One way or another, Earth was coming. The enemy's mockery. Deep within the Zarkali Empire, in the grand halls of High Command, the warning from Earth played before the gathered warlords, generals, and aristocrats. The holographic image of Admiral Graves flickered in the dark chamber, his voice cold and commanding. To the rulers of the Zarkali Empire, your crime has been witnessed. You have one chance. Surrender the ones responsible, or face the full wrath of Earth. You have 24 hours. The hologram disappeared, leaving behind only silence. For a brief moment, there was an air of uncertainty among the council. Then, laughter erupted. Lord General Karvok, a massive reptilian figure with golden scales, sneered. The humans think they can threaten us. His sharp teeth glistened under the chamber's dim lights. What arrogance! Several officers chuckled, nodding in agreement. They send a warning as if we fear them. Another general barked. Have they forgotten their place in the galaxy? They are nothing more than a minor species. They heal, they build, they talk of peace, but they do not fight. A holographic map of the galaxy glowed in the center of the room. The Zarkali Empire spanned dozens of star systems, their military strength unmatched by any of the weaker nations they had crushed before. Their fleets numbered in the thousands, their armies unstoppable. Karvok leaned forward, his claws tapping against the table. These humans are fools. They will come to fight, and they will die screaming. A smug communications officer stepped forward. Shall we send a response, my lord? Karvok smirked, his golden eyes burning with amusement. Yes, tell them what they need to hear. The officer nodded and activated the transmission system. A moment later, the message was sent to Earth. A single sentence. You will die like the weaklings you protect. Earth receives the answer. The moment the Zarkali transmission arrived, it was played before the United Terran Command. In the war room, Admiral Graves listened in silence as the enemy's arrogant message echoed across the chamber. Around him, officers clenched their fists, some grinding their teeth in anger. Graves exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. They have made their choice, he said, turning toward the fleet status report. Then we will give them what they asked for. He pressed a command on the table, and across the solar system, a single order was transmitted to every warship, every soldier, every pilot waiting for the final call. Operation Retribution is a go. Begin the assault. The war fleet launches. Across Earth's military installations, massive warships lifted from their docks, their engines roaring with power. The Terran Armada, a force never before unleashed on this scale, moved into formation. Supercarrier Retribution led the fleet, carrying thousands of advanced fighter squadrons. Dreadnought-class warships followed, their weapons powerful enough to crack small moons. Stealth frigates and rapid-strike corvettes raced ahead, preparing for deep space skirmishes. The Colossus-class railguns were mounted on specialized warships, capable of firing planetary bombardment shells from light years away. Inside the Retribution, General Marcus Rourke stood before his troops. Thousands of Marines, armored in cutting-edge Terran power suits, prepared for deployment. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were the best of the best. Weapons locked, nerves steady, and hearts burning with vengeance. Rourke's voice boomed across the hangars. We are not here to ask for peace. We are not here to talk. We are here because they killed our people. They thought we'd beg. They thought we'd retreat. He pointed toward the massive war map where the Zarkali stronghold was marked in red. They wanted war. He clenched his fists. So now we bring them hell. The massive doors of the hangar opened. The vacuum of space stretched beyond, and one by one, the dropships launched. The fleet vanished into hyperspace, heading straight for the Zarkali Empire. The enemy prepares for an easy victory. In the Zarkali capital, High Warlord Karvok stood on the command bridge of his flagship, the Doomcaller. From here, he watched as his fleets gathered, ready to destroy the humans once and for all. Their fleet was massive, stretching across the void in a sea of dark steel and red lights. Thousands of warships, planetary defense stations, orbital cannons, all prepared to obliterate the human fleet. Karvok chuckled. They marched to their deaths. Prepare to greet them. His officers saluted. The humans are fools. Their weapons are nothing compared to ours. Their numbers are a fraction of our strength. They do not stand a chance. Karvok smirked, watching the enemy fleet appear on the scanners. Then let's end this quickly. He leaned forward. Destroy them. First contact. The first shots fired. The Terran fleet emerged from hyperspace, cutting through the darkness like an unstoppable tidal wave. The Zarkali forces immediately opened fire, unleashing a storm of plasma cannons and missile barrages. But something was wrong. As the Zarkali watched their weapons fly toward the human fleet, something terrifying happened. The Terran warships didn't break formation. Instead, they accelerated, faster than any Zarkali commander expected, faster than should be possible. And then, the first human shots were fired. The dreadnought Titan's Wrath unleashed a planet-cracking railgun round, tearing through 3 Zarkali warships in a single shot. The Retribution's fighters swarmed forward, moving in perfect formations. Advanced Terran AI coordinated every movement, predicting enemy fire and dodging before they were even shot at. Inside their warships, Zarkali commanders panicked. Their speed, it's impossible. Our targeting systems can't keep up. One of the Zarkali admirals growled. This isn't a battle. His voice dropped to a whisper. This is an execution. The wrath of Earth has begun. As the first wave of Zarkali ships exploded in fire, Earth's response was clear. This was not a war of politics. This was vengeance. And for the first time in their history, the Zarkali realized. They had made a terrible mistake. First contact. A storm arrives. The battle had begun, but it was nothing like the Zarkali expected. They had envisioned a glorious slaughter, an effortless display of dominance over the weaker humans. Instead, what they got was hell itself. The sky burns. Admiral Graves stood at the bridge of the supercarrier Retribution, watching as the battle unfolded. The holographic display before him showed the chaos of war. Terran warships cutting through the enemy like a blade through flesh, railgun slugs and energy lances tearing Zarkali vessels apart. His expression remained cold, but his grip on the railing tightened. Status report, he ordered. A tactical officer turned from his station. Zarkali front lines are collapsing. Their ships aren't able to keep up with our targeting systems. Enemy losses, 372 warships. Human losses, 17. Graves barely nodded. He had expected as much. The Zarkali thought they were invincible, thought their empire was eternal. They had never fought humans in full war. They were learning now. Deploy Alpha and Omega squadrons, Graves ordered. It's time to crush their morale. The war machines of Earth. Across the battlefield, dozens of stealth frigates decloaked behind enemy lines. These were the Reaper-class stealth corvettes, equipped with cutting-edge technology that made them undetectable until they wanted to be seen. They had already infiltrated the heart of the enemy formation, waiting for the signal. Now, they struck. Dozens of torpedoes launched in perfect synchronization, bypassing Zarkali shields and detonating inside their main reactors. Zarkali warships erupted in brilliant explosions, their crews screaming in terror. From the Terran supercarrier Retribution, swarms of drones and strike fighters launched, moving faster than anything the Zarkali have faced before. Terran AI-controlled combat systems were centuries ahead of what the Zarkali even understood. Their pilots were cybernetically enhanced, trained from birth, and coordinated like a single living organism. The Omega squadrons engaged enemy fighters, their ships dodging enemy fire with impossible precision, while Alpha squadrons focused on enemy capital ships, launching high-impact kinetic warheads that burrowed into the hulls before exploding inside. "Admiral," an officer called, "the enemy fleet is fracturing." Graves exhaled slowly, then pressed the attack. The Zarkali panic. On board the Zarkali flagship Doomcaller, High Warlord Karvok watched in horror as his mighty fleet was torn apart. This wasn't a battle. This was an execution. How are they moving like that?" One of his generals shouted. "Their ships are too fast, too coordinated. Our targeting systems can't keep up. It's like they know where we'll fire before we do." Panic spread through the command deck. The once mighty warriors of the Zarkali had never known fear like this. Karvok clenched his fists. "Enough. Bring in the juggernauts. Crush them." His officers hesitated. "My lord, the juggernauts were designed for planetary siege, not for ship-to-ship combat." Karvok growled. "I said bring them in." Orders were sent. The massive Zarkali juggernauts, each the size of a small moon, began their slow advance. Their planetary-level plasma cannons charged up, preparing to fire. Karvok smirked. "Let's see your little warships survive this." But then, an alarm blared. "Sir, new Terran ships detected." Karvok's smirk vanished. "What?" "Earth's second wave arrives." The Zarkali Empire had assumed the first attack was the full extent of Earth's forces. They were wrong. Deep in space, massive ripples of blue light appeared as Terran reinforcements exited hyperspace. And then they came. 4 more dreadnoughts, each one the size of an entire battle fleet. 2 new supercarriers carrying over 50,000 fighter craft. Titan-class railgun platforms, each capable of firing a single kinetic slug powerful enough to shatter a planet's crust. The Zarkali officers watched in horror as the battlefield tripled in size, with new human ships swarming toward them like a tidal wave of death. Karvok took a step back, his golden eyes wide. "No, this isn't possible." "Sir," a panicked officer cried. The humans, they were holding back. The Terran response. The new Terran warships wasted no time. A single order rang across the fleet from Admiral Graves. "Unleash hell." The Titan-class railguns fired first. A single slug from the dreadnought Titan's Wrath tore through one of the Zarkali juggernauts, splitting it in half before its plasma cannon could even fire. The Zarkali defense lines crumbled. Terran bombers and strike craft overwhelmed the Zarkali capital ships, their precise attacks targeting weak points, forcing their shields to overload and leaving them vulnerable to devastating final blows. The Zarkali battle network collapsed under the onslaught of electronic warfare. Their communication lines scrambled, their targeting systems rendered useless. Their fleet was dying faster than they could react. On board the Doomcaller, Karvok clenched his claws. His mind raced. We have to retreat," he whispered, his voice barely audible. His generals turned to him in shock. "Retreat? But..." Karvok's scales darkened. "We can't win. We must fall back to the homeworld. Regroup." He never finished his sentence. Because at that moment, a Terran railgun slug tore through the Doomcaller, sending the entire bridge into chaos and fire. The flagship was falling, and the Zarkali Empire was crumbling before the wrath of Earth. The fall of the Zarkali fleet. As the Zarkali forces broke apart, their fleets desperate to retreat, the Terran armada did not stop. They pursued. Every retreating Zarkali vessel was hunted down. Every warship that surrendered was obliterated. The galaxy watched in horror as Earth delivered total annihilation upon the so-called unstoppable empire. By the time the battle ended, 90% of the Zarkali fleet was gone. What remained? A message the galaxy would never forget. Humanity had come, and the war was just beginning. The wrath of humanity. The battle in deep space had ended, but the war was far from over. The wreckage of the once mighty Zarkali fleet drifted lifelessly across the void. Thousands of burning warships, their once proud banners now nothing but floating debris, marked the aftermath of their failed attack. The Terran Armada had not just defeated them, it had annihilated them. Yet, even as the survivors of the Zarkali Navy fled in terror, humanity was not finished. This was no longer a battle for vengeance. This was extermination. The hunt begins. Admiral Graves stood aboard the Retribution, watching the final moments of the space battle unfold. His officers worked silently, their eyes fixed on the glowing tactical screens. The Zarkali fleet was shattered, their survivors scattered across the system. But the chase was not over. "Sir, Zarkali ships are in full retreat," a tactical officer reported. "Our long-range sensors detect multiple jump signatures. They're fleeing toward the homeworld." Graves narrowed his eyes. The fools still thought they could survive. He turned toward the communications officer. "Patch me through to the fleet." The officer nodded, and a moment later, his voice echoed across every warship, every fighter squadron, every Marine battalion preparing for the next phase. "We do not stop. We do not retreat. We pursue them to the last system, to the last world, to the very last Zarkali standing." These butchers thought they could attack us and walk away. They thought humanity would beg for mercy. His voice turned to steel. They were wrong. The fleet erupted into action. Stealth corvettes were deployed, tracking every escaping Zarkali vessel. Destroyers and warships broke formation, engaging in fast pursuit operations, striking down any stragglers before they could escape the system. Earth was not giving them a chance to breathe. The Zarkali homeworld, the last bastion. Far away, deep within the Zarkali Empire's home system, High Warlord Karvok stood inside the war room of his capital palace. His golden scales, once polished and gleaming with power, were now dulled with fear. His hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the war table, staring at the live reports from his fleet. They were losing. No, they had already lost. A general approached him hesitantly. "My lord, the human fleet." "Say nothing," Karvok growled, his claws digging into the table. His breathing was ragged, his eyes bloodshot. "I already know." He turned to the holographic map of the Empire. Red markers blinked everywhere. Every sector, every defense fleet, every outpost. Gone. The humans weren't just fighting them. They were erasing them. "My lord," another officer whispered, "perhaps we should surrender." "Perhaps." Karvok whirled around, his tail striking the officer with a bone-crunching force, sending him crashing to the ground. "Surrender?" he hissed. "You think we can bargain with them? You think they will listen to reason?" The room was silent. No one dared to answer. Because they all knew the truth. The Zarkali Empire had made an enemy of humanity, and humanity did not forgive. The sky darkens. A deep rumbling shook the atmosphere of the Zarkali homeworld. Civilians in the massive capital city of Varkan Prime looked up, eyes widening in horror. The skies were turning black. At first, it was just a shadow, a strange, creeping darkness that spread across the heavens. Then came the lights, thousands of tiny blue-white glows, flickering like distant stars. But these weren't stars. They were warships. The Terran Armada had arrived. From the supercarrier Retribution, Admiral Graves watched the Zarkali homeworld come into view. The once mighty capital of the Empire, its sprawling cities and grand towers stretching across the landscape, now lay before him. Waiting, Graves turned toward the fleet's command staff. "Begin orbital bombardment. No mercy." The order was sent, and the sky fell. Fire from the heavens. Terran warships unleashed hell. Titan-class railguns fired, sending massive tungsten slugs crashing into Zarkali fortresses, shattering them into craters. Missile barrages rained down, striking military outposts, supply depots, and command centers. Terran orbital artillery fired plasma lances, melting through enemy planetary shields like butter under a blowtorch. Stealth bombers struck hard targets, leveling entire defense sectors before the Zarkali even knew where to fire back. Panic spread across the Zarkali homeworld. The once proud Zarkali army, numbering in the millions, scrambled to prepare a planetary defense. Anti-air turrets lit up the skies, desperate to shoot down the endless swarm of Terran bombers and drones. It wasn't enough. Cities collapsed under the bombardment. Military installations crumbled. The planet was burning, and the humans were not stopping. From orbit, Terran ground forces were deployed. Thousands of drop pods, armored troop carriers, and mechs descended toward the surface, striking the ground like meteors. The invasion had begun. The fall of the Empire. In his war room, High Warlord Karvok watched it all unfold. The massive monitors showed his empire collapsing in real time. His generals were dead. His armies were broken. His people were fleeing in terror. He turned toward a single remaining officer. "How many forces do we still have left?" The officer swallowed. His voice was barely a whisper. "None." Karvok felt something he had never felt before. Defeat. He staggered backward, his golden eyes dull, his mind racing. This couldn't be happening. The Zarkali Empire had stood for 10,000 years. They had ruled dozens of systems, enslaved entire species, crushed countless civilizations. And yet, in a matter of days, they were gone. He looked at the screens, at the burning cities, at the bodies piling in the streets. His people were dying, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. A deep, shaking breath escaped him. Humanity had done this. Humanity had brought them to their knees. He clenched his fists, his claws digging into his palms. It should have been impossible. It should have been them standing victorious, watching Earth burn. But instead, they were the ones being erased. This wasn't just a war. This was an extinction, and Earth had delivered its judgment. The fall of the Zarkali Empire. The ashes of an empire. The once proud Zarkali homeworld, Varkan Prime, burned. Skyscrapers that had touched the clouds were now rubble and dust. The once thriving cities, filled with the towering statues of past warlords, were reduced to flaming ruins. The sky, once a brilliant shade of violet, was now black with smoke. From orbit, the United Terran fleet watched the devastation below. Supercarriers hovered like gods of war, their hulls reflecting the burning world beneath them. The Titan-class battleships remained in high orbit, their massive cannons still glowing from the planetary bombardment. Admiral Graves stood on the bridge of the Retribution, his face impassive as he stared at the destruction. Beside him, Commander Renata Wolf watched with quiet satisfaction. "We did it," she said, arms crossed. "The Zarkali Empire is finished." Graves didn't reply. Instead, he studied the tactical map, his sharp eyes scanning for any remaining resistance. "Not yet," he murmured. "Not completely." Part 6. The Fall of the Zarkali Empire. The ashes of an empire. The once proud Zarkali homeworld, Varkan Prime, burned. Skyscrapers that had touched the clouds were now rubble and dust. The once thriving cities, filled with the towering statues of past warlords, were reduced to flaming ruins. The sky, once a brilliant shade of violet, was now black with smoke. From orbit, the United Terran fleet watched the devastation below. Supercarriers hovered like gods of war, their hulls reflecting the burning world beneath them. The Titan-class battleships remained in high orbit, their massive cannons still glowing from the planetary bombardment. Admiral Graves stood on the bridge of the Retribution, his face impassive as he stared at the destruction. Beside him, Commander Renata Wolf watched with quiet satisfaction. "We did it," she said, arms crossed. "The Zarkali Empire is finished." Graves didn't reply. Instead, he studied the tactical map, his sharp eyes scanning for any remaining resistance. "Not yet," he murmured. "Not completely." The last war council of the Zarkali. Deep beneath the ruined capital, inside the Imperial war bunker, the last remnants of the Zarkali High Command had gathered. High Warlord Karvok stood at the head of the war table, his golden scales dark with soot, his once polished armor scratched and dented. His empire was gone, yet his claws still clung to the last shred of power he had left. His remaining generals, advisors, and warlords stood before him, their faces twisted with fear. One of them, a high-ranking officer, spoke with desperation in his voice. "My lord, we cannot hold the capital much longer. The humans are everywhere. Their war machines are tearing through our last lines of defense. We must." Silence. Karvok roared, slamming his fist onto the table. His breathing was ragged, his eyes burning with pure hatred. For the first time in Zarkali history, they were the ones being slaughtered. His generals fell silent, their heads lowering. They had no plan. They all knew the truth. The Zarkali Empire had ruled for over 10,000 years. It had conquered dozens of species, built a military stronger than any other, and crushed countless rebellions. And yet, in a matter of days, humanity had erased it from history. The Ground War, humanity's final march. On the surface, the Terran Marine Corps and shock troopers advanced through the burning ruins of the Zarkali capital, sweeping through every street, every bunker, every last stronghold. Terran battle tanks rolled over debris, their plasma cannons vaporizing entire enemy formations. Mech battalions, towering steel giants, crushed enemy resistance under heavy boots and autocannons. Drones and AI-controlled artillery provided support, executing perfectly coordinated attacks. The Zarkali warriors, once feared across the galaxy, were no match. Their weapons were outdated, their tactics useless, their warrior spirit broken. Some tried to fight. They were annihilated. Some tried to flee. They were hunted down. Some tried to surrender. But for many, mercy was not granted. This was not just a war. This was punishment, the execution of the warlords. In the shattered remains of the Zarkali Imperial war bunker, Karvok and his last generals were cornered. The massive doors burst open with an explosion, and Terran shock troopers stormed in, their advanced power armor gleaming with the dust of war. At the head of the squad was General Marcus Rourke, his battle-scarred face showing no emotion. His rifle was held casually, but his eyes were filled with steel. Karvok snarled, baring his sharp teeth. "Cowards! You think killing me will erase my empire?" Rourke stepped forward, looking down at the fallen warlord. "Your empire erased itself the moment it attacked our hospital ship." Karvok spat on the ground. "I should have destroyed your pathetic world when I had the chance." Rourke's expression didn't change. He simply raised his rifle and shot Karvok in the head. The High Warlord of the Zarkali Empire, ruler of an empire spanning 1,000 worlds, collapsed to the ground, lifeless. The last of the Zarkali warlords were rounded up, dragged before the Terran command, and executed before the eyes of their own people. The message was clear. The Zarkali Empire was dead. Message to the galaxy. The fall of the Zarkali was broadcasted across the stars. Every surviving empire, every alien race, every galactic power washed in silence. The once mighty Zarkali Empire, feared by so many for so long, had been wiped out in days. Their fleets destroyed, their cities reduced to ashes, their leaders executed, and Earth stood unchallenged. A final message was sent from the United Terran Command to every empire, every nation, every species across the known galaxy. A warning. This was not a war we wanted, but it was a war you forced upon us. Humanity is not weak. We are not prey. We are not to be tested. If you harm our people, we will not forget. We will not forgive. And we will find you. Let this serve as a lesson. The age of alien empires ruling the stars has ended. Now, the age of humanity begins. The transmission ended, and the galaxy shook with fear. Aftermath. The ghost of an empire. With Varkan Prime in ruins, what remained of the Zarkali people was scattered across the stars. Some became refugees, wandering the galaxy, forever haunted by the terror that Earth had unleashed upon them. Some tried to rebuild, forming small colonies, but they would never again rise to power. Some became slaves, taken by other alien empires, too weak to resist. The Zarkali, once a mighty force, had become nothing. And humanity had claimed its place as the new power of the galaxy. The final words. As Admiral Graves stood aboard the Retribution, watching the smoldering ruins of Farkan Prime, a young officer approached him. "Sir," the officer said quietly, "it's over." Graves nodded, his face unreadable. Yes, it's over. But as he looked at the burning world below, he knew the galaxy would never be the same again. Earth had not just won a war. It had reshaped the future of the stars. The message to the galaxy. The silence after the storm. The Zarkali Empire no longer existed. Where once stood a mighty civilization, an empire of warlords and conquerors, now remained only smoke, ashes, and silence. The once glorious capital, Farkan Prime, had been reduced to a graveyard of rubble and fire. The streets where Zarkali had once marched in parades of war now lay covered in the corpses of their own kind. The grand banners of conquest, once hung high on golden towers, were now torn and burned, flapping weakly in the acrid wind. The war was over, and Earth had won. Admiral William Graves stood on the command deck of the supercarrier Retribution, gazing at the ruined planet below. His reflection was cast upon the glass viewport, his expression unreadable. Behind him, the entire Terran fleet remained in formation, their weapons silent for the first time in days. Beside him, Commander Renata Wolf exhaled deeply. "I never thought I'd live to see this," she murmured. "Neither did they," Graves replied, his voice low and even. Renata smirked, but there was no humor in it. "The galaxy will remember this moment forever." Graves nodded. "And that's the point." He turned toward the communications officer. "Open a channel. Wide frequency. Every empire, every major power in the galaxy. Make sure they hear us." The officer swallowed hard but obeyed. Across the stars, on 1,000 different worlds, humanity's final message was about to be heard. A broadcast across the stars. Every major galactic leader, every council, every species received the transmission. The holographic projection flickered into existence in the heart of the Galactic Council chamber, where dozens of alien representatives sat in stunned silence. The image of Admiral Graves stood before them, his Terran Navy uniform crisp, imposing, unwavering. His gray eyes pierced through the void, carrying with them a message that no one dared to ignore. His voice, calm and powerful, rang through the great halls of power across the galaxy. "This is Admiral William Graves of the United Terran Command. The war against the Zarkali Empire is over. They thought they could attack an unarmed hospital ship. They thought humanity would stay silent." He leaned forward slightly. They were wrong. A pause. The tension in the air was thick, unbearable. Then his voice hardened. "This war was not one we sought, but it was one we finished. We did not come to negotiate. We did not come to beg. We came to deliver justice. And we have done so. Let this be a warning to all who listen. We are not conquerors. We are not invaders. We are not tyrants. But we are not prey. If you threaten humanity, if you harm our people, if you think you can do to us what you have done to others, we will find you. We will come for you. And we will end you." A final pause. The weight of his words crushed the room into absolute silence. Then his last words. "Remember the Zarkali." The transmission cut out, and across the galaxy, fear took root. The reactions. The galaxy trembles. For the first time, in thousands of years, the balance of power had shifted. The Galactic Council, once dismissive of humanity, now sat in terrified silence. The elder races, those who had looked down on Earth as a primitive young species, now questioned everything they thought they knew. The great warlords of the Orion Syndicate, who had once prided themselves as the strongest mercenaries in the galaxy, saw the footage of Earth's warships tearing through the Zarkali fleet like paper, and they felt fear. The Velos Dominion, a species of cold-blooded conquerors, whispered among themselves. They had once debated whether Earth should be subjugated. Now, they debated whether they should surrender in advance. The once proud Zarkali allies, who had cheered when Earth's hospital ship was destroyed, now erased all records of their friendship with the Zarkali, terrified of becoming the next target. No empire, no warlord, no council dared to respond to Earth's message. Because they all knew. There was no response. Earth's triumph, the rise of humanity. Back on Earth, the people celebrated. The broadcast was played in every city, every home, every colony. Humanity had not just won a war. It had changed the course of history. The once mighty galactic powers had been put in their place. No longer would humans be dismissed as a lesser race. No longer would their colonies fear invasion. Because now, the stars belonged to them. In the halls of the United Terran Command, the president of Earth, a woman named Kara Niland, stood before an audience of billions. Her voice, proud and unwavering, echoed across every screen. We did not ask for war. We did not seek blood. But when our people were slaughtered, we stood together. We fought, and we won. She raised a hand toward the stars. Humanity stands united. We will not be broken. We will not be ruled. We will not be ignored. A moment of silence. Then her final declaration. From this moment on, Earth is no longer just a world. We are no longer just a species. We are a power among the stars. And across the galaxy, those words were heard. The age of humanity had begun. Epilogue. The legacy of war. Months after the war, deep in an unknown sector of space, a group of alien diplomats and warlords gathered in secret. Their voices were hushed, their faces grim. Earth has changed everything, one whispered. They destroyed an empire in days, another muttered. They are too dangerous. We must act before it's too late. The room was filled with uneasy murmurs. Plans were whispered. Alliances were discussed. And in the shadows, the seeds of the next great conflict were planted. Because while Earth had won this war, the galaxy was not done with them yet. And the future would bring new enemies, new battles, and new legends. For humanity, this was just the beginning.